We are in week, I think it's 15 of our message series that we've called The Lazarus Life. We will finish it next Sunday, but today we're going to jump right in and talk about what Lazarus' story teaches us about extravagant worship. So if it's your first Sunday with us, or maybe first in a long time, the story of Lazarus is found in John chapter 11 and 12. It's a story of a man who is friends with Jesus, who gets sick and dies, and then Jesus shows up 4 days later and calls him back to life. It is the resurrection of Lazarus is really kind of the gospel in a nutshell. It invites us to ask all kinds of questions that the rest of the New Testament spends time answering. Things like, why do bad things happen to good people? Why doesn't Jesus always answer the way I want him to or when I want him to? What do I do when Jesus shows up in my life and I think it's too late, or he asks me to do something that doesn't make sense? What do I do when Jesus calls me into new life and into obedience, but it's difficult or awkward? What do I do when he calls me to help others do that? And all of these are asked and answered in the story of Lazarus. This morning, we're going to see what Lazarus' story teaches us about offering Jesus our most extravagant worship in response to what he has done for us. So we'll be in John chapter 12 this morning. Now, most of the time when we talk about the story of Lazarus, we finish when Lazarus walks out of the tomb and goes back to Bethany. But his story actually continues in John chapter 12, and we'll see today that there's a big celebration after Lazarus has been resurrected. And then we'll see next week that there is an ongoing attempt to get Lazarus back in the grave, because of what God has done in his life. So we'll finish up with those two ideas. But today, John chapter 12, we'll start in verse 1. If you don't have a Bible, it'll be here on the screens for you. It says, 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany where Lazarus lived, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. Here a dinner was given in Jesus' honor. Martha served, while Lazarus was among those reclining at the table with him. Then Mary took about a pint of pure nard, an expensive perfume. She poured it on Jesus' feet and wiped it with her hair. And the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. But one of his disciples, Judas Iscariot, who was later to betray him, objected. Why wasn't this perfume sold and the money given to the poor? It was worth a year's wages. He did not say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. As keeper of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put into it. Leave her alone, Jesus replied. It was intended that she should save this perfume for the day of my burial. You will always have the poor with you, but you will not always have me. Now, again, we're going to talk about extravagant worship, and I will be the first to admit this passage would not have been my choice for a Father's Day message. When you think of like what kind of object, lesson, or thing would you want to help you on Father's Day communicate the power, the love, the might of Jesus, a little jar that holds perfume would not have been my first choice. Right? I would have picked stories of Jesus driving out demons, Jesus flipping over tables, Jesus calming the seas, Jesus feeding the multitudes. Maybe we go to the Old Testament and we talk about how God shuts the mouths of lions, how he defeats giants, any of those types of things. Right? But because of the passage we're in today, it leads us to consider that Mary is not just for women. Right? And I don't know, you're probably all far more mature than I am, but that there's a temptation to read that passage and be like, that would be a great women's conference sermon. Let's pour our perfume out on Jesus' feet, and let's wipe his, with our hair, and let's sing songs about laying our head against his chest and feeling his heartbeat. And, let's just really kind of the emotive experience. And then Father's Day, it's like we want to sing A Mighty Warrior is Our God, right? A mighty fortress. We want to sing the big, the soaring, the masculine. And yet what we see here is not just Jesus saying, hey, I'm going to tell you a story that women are going to apply. But he says, I'm going to tell you a story that's going to be told forever. And everywhere the gospel goes, this story will be told. And if you go all the way back to John chapter 11, to the very beginning of the story of Lazarus, we're introduced to Lazarus this way. It says, now a man from Bethany was sick, named Lazarus. His sister was Mary, the one who poured perfume on Jesus' feet. Right, so Mary is actually the way that Lazarus gets introduced. So there is something in Mary's response that is supposed to trigger something in us. And I think the thing that triggers in us, whether we are male or female, whether we like stories like this or they make us uncomfortable, is this idea that the extravagant worship of Mary is a response to an extravagant God. All right, so the setting of what is happening here is basically there is a thank you dinner that's occurring. Right? Jesus has raised Lazarus from the dead, and then Jesus has left Bethany, but now he has returned. And it seems like it's a pretty short period of time that he's returned, and most likely he has returned at the invitation of Lazarus, Martha, and Mary. They have decided, in light of what Jesus has done, we need to thank him for it, and we need to celebrate him. Right? They're reflecting something that you and I should do as well. Of anytime we experience the provision of God, anytime we experience an answered prayer, we want to observe it, we want to thank him for it, and we want to celebrate it with others. We want to draw attention to it. It's like the story that Luke tells us of the 10 lepers who come to Jesus. And he heals all of them, but only one comes back to thank him. Mary and Martha and Lazarus, they're modeling the response of that one of, hey, we see what the Lord has done, and so we need to celebrate it. We need to thank him. This is a corporate worship event. And it challenges me because I know, for me at least, there are times in life where God answers miraculously, where he answers big prayers, and there's a real quick temptation to be like, thank you, and now on to the next thing I need from you. All right, like, God, thanks for delivering, thanks for healing, but now I need this provision, now I need this for my kids, now I need that for my wife, now I need that at work, now I need this for the house, now I need... And so what they're modeling is just this, hey, just stop. Just stop for a moment and let's throw some intentional parties to celebrate what God is doing. Now, in the middle of this corporate event, Mary has a private, a personal worship moment. For Mary, it's not enough for her to just celebrate with a meal to welcome Jesus into her home, but it says that she goes and she gets this pint of pure nard. And Judas will later tell us it's very expensive. It's worth a year's wages. So Mary is bringing the best thing that she has for Jesus, right? And helping us to understand that extravagant worship is a natural response to the extravagance of God. Now, that perfume was rare. It came from northern India, and hers was pure, right? It was undiluted. She did not get the knockoff nard at Ross that you and I buy. Now, this is the pure thing. I don't know what expensive cologne or perfume is like. I don't think I've ever spent more than about $15 on a bottle. And some of you are like, we've walked by you. We know. That's rude. I have allergies and can't smell well, okay? So, but anyways, I don't know what that's like. But what I do know is how much money I make in a year, right? And you know how much money you make in a year. And so for just a moment, you might not be able to sympathize or to put yourself in the spot of like, hey, I'm going to pour oil on Jesus' feet, and I'm going to dry it with my hair. Like that might be a cultural bridge too far for most of us. But can you, for just a moment, imagine what it would be like to be so moved by the extravagant work of God in your life that you were to offer him a gift that cost you the equivalent of 1 year's wages? And so just for a moment, picture that number in your mind, right? Maybe your individual income, your household income, not the one you put on your taxes, but the actual number, right? The real number before the deductions and before everything else, the before the government takes it out, all of it. Like, just take that gross number. And now imagine for a moment, what would it be like to offer that gift? I've ran through this thought experiment several times this week of what would it feel like to write that check, equivalent to a year's worth of my earnings? What would it feel like to offer something that was worth a year's worth of my salary? And if in that thought experiment you immediately think, I would never do that, that is so irresponsible, I would not just do something like that, then just a word of warning. There's a person in the story who has that response. But it's not Jesus, it's Judas. Right? And Judas is never our role model, just so you know. Okay, it's really interesting. If you go back and read through John, every time Judas is referred to, John sticks a dig in there. He's a thief. He's the one who betrayed Jesus. He's the one, you're right, like they're determined of no one's going to forget who Judas really was. Right? We don't name our kids Judas, do we? No. If you thought you were naming him in Judah and you added the wrong number, you're going to change that you're going to change that quickly, right? So here's the thing. If in that experiment you're thinking, I could never do it, we'll get to this in a moment, but maybe you haven't fully experienced the extravagant nature of God's love for you. Because when you do, you can't help but do it. So just, again, put yourself in Mary's position. Just a couple weeks earlier, her brother has been sick and dying. And if someone had come to her at that point and said, hey, Mary, Lazarus can be healed, but it's going to cost you that jar of nard that you've been holding on to. It's going to cost you a year's worth of your wages. To heal her brother, she would have gladly given that to make it happen. And now that she's on the other side of the miracle, she knows Jesus has given me the best that he has, so I'm going to offer the same back to him. I love the way that John Piper describes this interaction here. He says, it is a beautiful thing when the worth of Jesus and the love of his followers match. When the value of his perfection and the intensity of our affections correspond. This is what's happening in Bethany. Right? Mary recognizes who Jesus is. She recognizes what Jesus has done. And her only response is, I've just got to give him the best thing that I have. I can't hold anything back from him. Now from that gift, it would seem that Mary and Martha and Lazarus are people of some degree of wealth. And we've seen this kind of throughout the story. They have a home that's large enough to host Jesus and all his disciples. Lazarus is buried in a tomb, not just in the grave like a poorer person would have been. And now Mary offers this extravagant gift. And so it seems that they are people of some degree of wealth. And yet, no matter how wealthy they might have been, this gift is still extravagant. You can see it in the response of the disciples. You can see it just in Mary's willingness of, I see who Jesus is. And so I have to give him my best. It's a beautiful thing, Piper says, when the worth of Jesus and the love of his followers match. Extravagant worship is a response to what God has done. Right? Mary isn't giving something to Jesus to get something from him. She's giving because of what she has already received. Now, it's pagan religion that turns our relationship with God into a transaction, right? And that says, well, I will give this so that God will give me that. And I will give him more extravagant gifts so that he will bless me more extravagantly. And some of those ideas kind of filter their way into the church at times, even of, hey, you need to worship Jesus so he'll bless you. Right? But the scriptural understanding, what we see from Mary is, you need to worship Jesus because he has blessed you. You need to give to Jesus so that he can give to you. No. We're going to pour out extravagant gifts of worship because we understand what we've already received. And so if we're in a spot this morning where we're thinking, I don't really have a reason to give God my best. Right? If I ever come to that point in my life, then I have to start asking myself, have I actually experienced his transforming power? Or am I just observing him from a distance? Have I actually begun the path of the disciple? Have I experienced his resurrection in my life? Or am I just kind of standing on the side thinking, well, if he does something really great, then I'll do something in response for him? Mary's source of joy, her source of worship is pure. She recognizes what Jesus has done, and she's responding to that. She doesn't care if it's culturally appropriate. She doesn't care if she's going to be judged as being wasteful or thoughtless by others. All she knows is Jesus is here, and I'm so grateful for what he's done that I've got to pour out the very best thing I have. Right? And so what we want to think about this morning is the extravagant gifts of God to us are what provoke extravagant worship. Right? It's not about me trying to convince you need to give something better to Jesus. It's not about being pressured into it in some way. It's not about trying to match what other people have done. It's not about trying to find, well, what's my equivalent of a pint of nard, and then I'm going to do that just to make sure I'm a good disciple. No. What we want to provoke in you today is this idea of when I stop and consider the extravagant nature of Jesus Christ, I can't help but respond with extravagant worship. I can't help but give him my best. Right? It's like, dads, okay, it's Father's Day. So I don't know in your family how high or how low the bar is on Father's Day. No judgment. Like I bought the Father's Day card for my dad yesterday, and he lives in Florida. So, already like send him the text, Happy Father's Day. Your card will be late again. My little sister at least took care of the gift, right? So I sent her money. So really like just son of the year right here, honestly. And so sometimes at Father's Day, though, there's this idea of, hey, kids, like the tie is cool, right? Do you know how much I give you? I know none of you, because you are selfless fathers. And you just give of yourselves, right? But occasionally I've heard there are some dads who can kind of have this feeling of like, do you remember what we did for Mother's Day? Right? It was kind of big. It was a big deal. We did a lot of stuff. Why are we running errands on Father's Day? Right? Why am I in Walmart on Father's Day? This is like the worst. This is the seventh layer of hell for me. And you're subjecting me to it, but it's okay because we're going to get steaks that I get to grill myself. Like, what in the world's going on here? And we just have this thought of, I just want my kids to appreciate it. Just tell me thank you, right? Now, the card I did get from my dad, very thoughtful. Very thoughtful. It expresses everything that my children should be expressing to me, right? And maybe by the time they're 39, they will be as well. So, but there's just that thought as a dad of sometimes, like, it's only kind of as you step into that role of being a dad that you really appreciate everything your dad did for you. Moms, it's the same way. When you become a mom, you have a new appreciation for your mom. And when you get married, you have a new appreciation for other people who have been married. And so your appreciation is provoked by your experience. And this is what's happening for Mary, and this is what should be happening for us as we begin to experience the extravagant gifts of God. They provoke, they cause to rise up in us these acts of extravagant worship. When I begin to understand what my salvation actually entails, that I was dead, I was lifeless, I was separated from God, and He, through His own choosing, laid down His life and brought me into His family. When I understand the restoration, that all the destruction that my sin has caused, and Jesus comes and not only forgives it, but He begins a process of restoration and reconciliation. When I understand the amazing love that God pours out on me, that He doesn't love me because of what I do, but because of who I am, because He created me, He called me, because I'm His son, because you're His daughter. When you begin to grasp these things, when you know the deep sense of peace that comes from the presence of Jesus, when you know the joy that runs deeper than your circumstances, the joy that breaks through grief, the joy that breaks through depression, the joy that sustains you through the darkest nights of your soul, when you begin to experience those types of things that I can't find this anywhere else, then Mary's response doesn't seem so extravagant. It seems appropriate. Right? And so any time we begin to look in our life and say, you know what, there's a lack of authentic worship. There's a lack in my heart of extravagant gratitude. There's a lack of extravagant praise, of extravagant thankfulness. Anytime we can come into a Sunday morning and just kind of stand there as we sing about the glory of God, anytime we can read the scriptures and their descriptions of who God is and what He does, and our hearts aren't moved and our minds aren't awakened, in any of those moments, it's not a lack of God's action, it's a lack of our reflection. Right? That lack of extravagant worship just means you're paying attention to the wrong things. You're not focusing on who's in the room with you. You're not focusing on what He has done for you. And as we begin to engage in extravagant worship, we see not only does it turn our attention towards Jesus, but it turns the attentions of others as well. Extravagant worship changes the environment. John tells us that as Mary poured the perfume on Jesus' feet, the fragrance filled the room. Right? And as that fragrance fills the room, this becomes something that's not just between Mary and Jesus, but others are now invited to participate in. I mean, and just even there, the story of Lazarus, there's all these little layers to it. So the previous time that Mary and Martha and Jesus and Lazarus are together, there's a fragrance that fills the area. Right? And it's the stench of death. It's the smell of decomposition. When Jesus says, roll away the stone, Martha responds, no, Lord, he stinks. And Jesus doesn't argue with her because Lazarus does. And as they roll away the stone, that stench of death comes out and it fills the cemetery and it surrounds them. And it's a reminder to them of the finality of death. And then Jesus calls Lazarus back to life and he tells them, go get those grave clothes off. And as they get up close, that stench of death is still there. Right? And as they walk back to their home, that stench of death is still on Lazarus until he is bathed and cleaned. It stays there. And now, about a week or so later, they are gathered together again. And this time, there's a new fragrance that fills the room. And it's a fragrance of extravagant worship. It's a fragrance that reminds them of God's power. It's a fragrance that reminds them of where there once was only death, now there is life. So you can just imagine in that setting, Martha is busy preparing the meal and serving the meal. And as she smells that aroma begin to fill the room, she stops and she turns her attention to Jesus and to Mary. It says that Lazarus is reclining with Jesus, enjoying the meal. And as he begins to smell it, he stops and he turns his attention. And can you imagine the way that Lazarus' spirit would have been moved as he sees the sister he loved pouring out the greatest thing that she has on the God who gave him life? You imagine the friends and the family who are gathered in the home that day and the tears that would come to their eyes, the powerful memories that would flood from just a short time ago of where there was once death, now there is life. Extravagant worship changes the environment. Right? And the same thing still happens for you and I when we worship Jesus extravagantly in our words and in our actions. In our serving and in our giving, in our going and in our sacrificing, whatever it looks like for you, when you do that, it changes the environment around you. It changes the environment in your marriage. It changes the environment in your home. It changes the environment in your car. It changes the environment in your classroom, in your office. It changes the environments of churches. You walk in and you can notice both a spiritual and a physical difference of something's going on here. This is what happens on a Sunday morning when we sing together. There's a moment where if you come in late, as you walk in the doors, you know this is different. It's different in here than it was out there. And what's the difference? The difference is extravagant worship being poured out. This is the feeling you get. It's how your heart swells with faith when someone else begins to tell you their story of God's provision. What's happening? Their extravagant worship is changing your environment. It's the goosebumps you feel when somebody else starts to tell you, this is how Jesus led me, and this is how he directed me, and this is how he was with me. It's the shout that escapes your lips as someone else is telling you their story of God's deliverance. It's the tears that fill your eyes as somebody is telling you about how God walked with them through their darkest moments. In all of these, the extravagant worship of others is changing the environment for you. So worship then becomes part of our testimony. Worship is part of our declaration of, hey, why are you giving that? Hey, why are you going there? Hey, why are you serving there? It provides a platform to say, because of what Jesus has done for me. And when you volunteer to serve at the New Life Festival in downtown Tulsa and your friends or neighbors are saying, where are you going and what are you doing? And you tell them and the opportunity is, they say, why? That's your moment. That's your breakthrough. That's your pour the perfume on Jesus' feet because Jesus has done so much for me. Because I know new life. I'm not just looking for somebody to pray a conversion prayer. I want people to know the fullness of life that Jesus has brought to me. I want them to know his miracle working power. I want them to know his transforming presence. Extravagant worship changes the environment by providing a platform for God's people to declare his glory, to declare his grace. And this is why extravagant worship is a Father's Day message, it's a Mother's Day message, it's a Kids' Day message, if there was such a thing, right? It's a Grandparents' Day message, it's an Aunt and Uncle's message, it's an everyday message because it's for every follower of Jesus. Jesus told us Mary's story will be told wherever the gospel goes to remind us that the extravagant love of God will provoke extravagant worship in us. And the response of everyone when we see that should be, that's awesome. We should be like Mary. We can't finish this story without acknowledging that there are some who will misunderstand extravagant worship. Right? And again, this is not the model for us to follow. We're not supposed to be Judas in the story. We're supposed to be Jesus or Lazarus or Martha or Mary or any of the other disciples. Anyone but Judas. But when Judas sees the perfume poured out on Jesus' feet, his response, one of the other translations says, "Why this waste? Why this waste?" And this is a view that the world will have and continues to have when God's people worship him extravagantly. Why would you give that money away? Why would you use your vacation time to serve at that camp for kids in foster care? Why would you devote so much of your energy to these things, to these places? Why would you not live in the biggest house you can afford? Why would you not drive the newest car that you can have? Why would you sacrifice things that make your life better or more enjoyable for the sake of something else? And it seems wasteful and it seems useless. I remember when I was in high school, our youth pastor challenged us to give to missions, and there was a little commitment card. So we filled it out, and as a 16-year-old, I committed to give $10 a month. $120 a year, which felt like a whole lot of money at the time. And I had taken that and I put it in my wallet and I carried it with me, and it was my reminder to make that pledge every month. And I remember sitting in a class in my public high school in Topeka, and I don't know what we were supposed to be doing, but we weren't doing it, right? And so at some point it turned into, hey, give me your wallet, let me see everything you have in there. So as a teenage boy, you're just trying to fill your wallet with something. Right? There were no, we didn't have credit cards or debit cards or any of that. You had a few bucks in cash, you had your driver's license, you had your student ID, and then it was just a collection of junk that you would keep in there to make you feel like a man. Here's my coupons, because your dad always had a big fat wallet, and you felt like you needed one too, right? And so one of my buddies, he was going through mine, and there's the Dairy Queen coupon, and we all knew that wasn't going to last more than a day or two, and there were some of the other things in there, and then they pulled out my little Speed the Light commitment. And they said, hey, what's this? Oh, that's it's like a missions thing at my church, and so I give, and they're like, you're going to give $120? It's like, yeah, but it's over the course of a year. You're going to give $120? Yeah, I'm going to. And I'll never forget the look on my friend's face. He looked at me and said, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. And in that moment, I didn't care because I knew how dumb my friends were. I don't value your opinion. I know what you spend $120 on, right? So Marlboro Lights that your older brother buys for you. But anyways, it's just that moment of I don't care. But there's that space that comes for all of us where just people don't understand. Or we see it happen again and again when somebody decides, hey, I know this is maybe the path that my family had for me. I know this is the path I've always said I'm going to walk on, but late in high school, early in college, at some point in my career, I feel God diverting me. And friends and family, they meet that with, hey, yeah, it's cool to work in a church, but you're too smart for that. It's great to be a missionary, but yeah, man, you've got so much potential over here. You could support a lot more missionaries if you just work this job and earn that money. Right? It's wonderful for you to want to be a teacher or to serve in this nonprofit, but God has equipped you to have so much influence in these other areas. And anytime we say yes to Jesus, there are going to be others who say that doesn't make sense, that's nonsense. In the words of Judas, they'll say, why this waste? And I love the way there's a guy named John Bloom who writes about this response. He says, we hear in Judas's words the world's appraisal of us. They watch as time, intellect, money, youth, financial future, and vocations are poured out on Jesus' feet. They watch them puddle on the floors of churches, mission fields, orphanages, and the homes where children are raised and careers are lost. And what they see is foolish waste. Do not expect their respect. Right? And this is where extravagant worship leads us. It leads us to a point where we have to decide, I don't really care what you think because I know what I've experienced. I don't really care how you evaluate my gift because I know the one whom I'm giving it to. I don't care if you think it's wasteful. I don't care if you think it's thoughtless. I have carefully evaluated this and determined that Jesus is worth it and more. Right? You see, ultimately our extravagant worship is not for others, so we really can't worry about what they think. When you worship Jesus extravagantly, there are going to be people who tell you, hey, you need to dial it back. There might even be Christian people who tell you, like, hey, that's cool, but maybe don't make a habit of that. Right? There's just these moments where no one, if they don't understand what Jesus has done for me, they're not going to understand what I'm doing for him. And we've got to just be okay with that. You can't live your life for the approval, for the respect of others. Mary, there's so much that's wrong with what she does. Right? It's wasteful for her to pour such an expensive gift out on Jesus' feet. It's culturally inappropriate for her to let her hair down in the presence of men that she's not married to, much less dry his feet with her hair. And yet in all of these spaces, Mary adopts the attitude of, I know what Jesus has done. And so all I can do is offer my best to him. Why is Mary's story told everywhere the gospel goes? Because we need to know that when you know Jesus, you worship him. That's the only response. When you know him, you worship him. When you experience the extravagant gifts of God, it provokes extravagant worship in you. And so for those of us this morning who think, that's maybe a bridge too far, then the starting point is not go get your best and bring it to Jesus. The starting point is ask Jesus to let you experience his best. Ask him to pour out his love in your heart. Ask him to remove the shame, the guilt, the fear. Ask him to restore purpose, to bring back joy, to give peace, to give hope, to flood your heart and mind with the love of Christ for you. To remind you that he has prepared every moment of every day for you. And as you begin to have those experiences, extravagant worship won't seem so extravagant. It'll seem natural. It will seem logical. It will seem unavoidable. So on Father's Day, dads, what we want to consider for just a moment is what kind of extravagant worship are we modeling for our kids? Because they're watching us. They're listening to us. They're observing us. They see how we spend our time. They see how we spend our money. They see the things that we get really fired up about when we start talking about them. They see us when we come to church. They see us as we worship. They see us when we pray or when we don't pray. They know if we're reading our Bible, if we're not reading our Bible. They know how we respond when others bring up the things of God, if we eagerly jump into those conversations or if we awkwardly remove ourselves from them. And in all of those spaces, Dad, we have the blessing to lead them to become extravagant worshipers of Jesus. You don't have to get it right. You don't have to know all the words of the song. You don't have to be able to recite every scripture. You just have to dwell on what God has done in you. And then give him your best, give him your attention, give him your devotion, and you can begin to set patterns in your family of extravagant worship being the normal response to Jesus. Of extravagant gifts, right? To where your family loves Jesus to the point that you're telling your kids one day, hey, so I gave this to the church and your inheritance is a little less. I gave this to that mission, and you know, instead we're not going to do some of these other things. And my hope in those seasons is my kids will have the same response that I would have if my dad of, hey, that's awesome. That's great. I know what Jesus has done for me. I know what he's done for you, Dad. I know what he's doing in us. That's great. Let's go. Let's move forward. But dads, there's an unending temptation for us to give our best to things that are far less than Jesus. Your job will not sustain your children. Your hobbies and interests will not sustain your children. Your favorite teams and activities and politicians will not sustain your children. These things might be worth our attention, but they are never worthy of our devotion. Only Jesus gets all of our worship. Only Jesus gets our best. He's the only one that we can lay it all down for. And so whether that makes you comfortable or uncomfortable, my hope for you today is that you will just begin to ask the Lord to reveal his extravagant love, his extravagant power, his extravagant gifts to you. And as you do, Mary moves from just kind of this object out here of like, oh yeah, I guess some people do that. Somebody much more up close and personal. Well, of course she did that. I would do the same thing. I am doing the same thing. Because when you've experienced his best, you can't help but give him yours. He gets all your time. He gets all your attention. You talk to him and you talk about him. You sing loudly. You pray passionately. You serve him not out of obligation, but out of appreciation. So if you'll stand with me this morning, I want to pray a quick prayer for you. Then the band's going to come back and lead us in a final song. Jesus, we come to you today asking that you would reveal who you are to us. Lord, we want to worship you extravagantly, not out of obligation, but out of appreciation. Lord, will you come today and lift our hearts, lift our eyes to see you for who you are? You see all of our requests, you see all of our needs, but Lord, today, may we see all the ways that you have provided, that you have saved, that you have healed, that you have delivered, that you have restored. And God, as we do, may it fill our hearts with an abundance of love, with a willingness to worship you. God, we come today asking that all of our attention, all of our affection would be turned towards you and given to you. Jesus, will you overcome the parts of our culture, the parts of our personality that seem to inhibit us from expressing our praise, our worship, our thanksgiving? Lord, will you overwhelm us with your extravagant gifts? And may we respond with extravagant worship to you. In Jesus' name, amen.